Hi YouTube, it's Kathy, and this is my weekly entertainment wrap-up for May 12th through 18th. This week I read 3 books, I watched 2 movies, and I listened to 1 book. Firstly, before you ask, yes, I have moved from this spot since last week when I put out 2 videos in this location. I even proved it to you by shuffling you slightly down the table, and if you're really lucky, the lizard might come out of her little rock enclosure and you'll see her in the background. Last time I was hoping the cats would join me, but they're actually locked in a room because, the big cat will not let me do this if I want to do this unless he's locked in the room with a fish snack, so here we are. If you've been here before, you know that this is not my usual filming location. This is my best friend's house, and by the way, get yourself a best friend that makes you fresh baked goods when you house sit for her and pet sit for her, and also has a coffee machine that you understand how to use so you can make your own coffee. Everything in this wrap-up I read at least in part in this house because I was here at the beginning of the week, I'm here at the end of the week, and there's only 1 movie on this list that I watched at home. First this week we have Listen for the Lie, which is one of my Book of the Month books. This is about this woman whose best friend died 5 years ago and everyone thinks she did it, and the thing is she has no idea if she did it or not because her memory of that night has been completely wiped. However, the next morning she was walking to town covered in her best friend's blood, so who knows? At this point, she's kind of moved on in her life as much as one can do in a situation like that, and she's living in Los Angeles with this guy who she's kind of into but not really that into, and she's got this job that she's kind of into but not really that into, and somebody popular in the true crime space decides to make a new podcast about her best friend's case, and all of a sudden she finds herself fired, and all of a sudden her boyfriend is looking at her like, "Are you going to murder me in my sleep?" So when her grandmother invites her back to her hometown for her 80th birthday, she feels kind of compelled to go because she actually really loves her grandmother, and who is also there but the guy producing the podcast. The thing is, she actually wants to figure out who killed her best friend, whether or not it was her, so they team up and try to figure it out. This did have a lot of fun elements. The whole "I don't know if it happened or not" thing really makes you suspicious throughout. There were a few things that I was like, oh, this is not ethical, and I could not actually follow a true crime reporter that did things like this, because in my spare time I do watch a fair amount of true crime and I try to only consume it from very ethical sources, so take that as you will. However, because I spend so much time watching different people reporting on true crimes, obviously this book was right up my alley. Next we have You, Me, and Bad Movies, which is a book I primarily picked up because it crosses off 2 squares on this month's Read Queer All Year prompts board. Those squares are agender rep and pansexual or panromantic rep. Our main character in this book is Avery. About 3 months ago, they had a pretty bad breakup that was pretty sudden and it kind of really sucked. And they've really not wanted to put themselves out there romantically because of that, because they still have this heartbreak. However, for the past 2 months or so, they've had this pen pal. They don't know who this pen pal is, but one time they actually found this note in their school's library and they wrote back to that note, and they've been trading notes back and forth, mostly about bad movies. And then one of them will watch the movie, they'll talk about the movie, those types of things. However, these 2 people have never actually met and they don't know who each other are. However, Avery has gotten to the point where they would really like to meet Kay, this person they've been writing letters to. And the book goes from there. This was enjoyable. It wasn't my favorite thing that I've ever read, but I really did enjoy trying to figure out who Kay could possibly be, and then once you find out who that is, what's going on and why they wouldn't maybe mesh, or maybe they will mesh. But there's this whole backstory problem about why Kay thinks that Avery or A probably won't want to hang out with them. There was a lot of sadness and heartsickness when it came to certain aspects of this book, but overall it was just like warm contemporary fluff that I really enjoy. Next we have How the Boogeyman Became a Poet, which is a memoir in verse. This is all about Toby Keith Jr. growing up, realizing that he's a queer black man, and what that looks like when he's in his high school years and when he starts going to university. This is kind of a mixture of the type of poetry that's very similar to prose, so you're getting all of these details about these different people and all these things, and then occasionally he would actually insert poems that were written at the time, and those were much more structured like what we would usually think of as poetry. Poetry, by the way, is such a broad category that I always feel kind of simple-minded while trying to talk about it, because I'm just like, I mostly feel like I'm talking out of my butt when I talk about poetry because I don't know everything about poetry. And yes, I understand that I don't know everything about most things, and yet I'll also talk about them and not feel weird about it, so I don't know why I have this hang up on poetry, but it's definitely not just me. I've seen other people say basically the same thing before. One thing I really enjoyed about this is this author is about 5 years older than me, so even just seeing their experience of like trying to get on the internet and talk to people on the internet about the fact that he might be queer, which was even more of an ordeal than it would have been for me if I had realized I was queer at that age. I would recommend picking this one up, and if you haven't figured out something for the Anthology Square or the Black History Square for the Queer Lit Readathon Round 13 coming up in June, this is something that could fill either of those squares. An argument could be made. Yes, it is a memoir, but it's also a collection of poems, which I always think of as an anthology. Do with that as you will. We're really wishy-washy. As long as you can talk your way into thinking that something fits a prompt, it probably fits the prompt. As for the movies I watched this week, I had another movie on my list that I was like, well, I can only watch this when Chad isn't around, and because I was pet sitting, Chad wasn't around, so I decided to put on Killer Book Club. Firstly, going into this, I did not know that it was originally in Spanish, so I did have to use the dub, but there are options of either watching it with captions or watching it dubbed, and I watched it dubbed. This is a very cheesy horror movie that knows the cheesy horror movie tropes and then uses them. And I won't say that it was anything fantastic. I kind of liked the cinematography though. There were certain aspects of the lighting that was specifically used that I really enjoyed. But at the end of the day, I don't think this is something you would really write home about. I don't know if this was something that the characters in Yumi and Bad Movies would specifically talk about, but maybe they would, depending on how they feel about killer clowns. I didn't even tell you what it was about. It's about this book club that was specifically reading this book that had to do with a killer clown, and then something happens to one of them. They decide that they want to get revenge on somebody. That goes horribly awry, and then suddenly this killer clown, who has to be somebody within their group, starts killing off people in the group and then writing about it online. Absolutely wild premise and a fine enough time for what it was. The other movie I watched this week was Rebel Moon Part 1. This is something that made it onto our movie list. I have no idea how, and now I know that last month they released a Part 2, and there's eventually going to be a Part 3 from my understanding. At the very beginning of this, it seemed like it was going to be very politics heavy, which is just not my sort of thing, so as it was starting, I was like, Chad, we're gonna check in like 10 minutes, and if we want to know about this because it's super politics heavy, then we can. Just because I often have a hard time figuring out and caring about who belongs to which group and why do these people hate each other. However, that aspect of it was really simplified in this movie, so I didn't have any trouble being like, ah yes, that one, that looks like a certain political party from maybe the 1930s and 40s in a different country. That one's clearly the evil one. And then, yes, this person has a backstory where she had to work for the evil ones, and now she's just trying to be a farmer, but they won't let her, and now she has to lead a rebellion. I thought there were aspects of this that, again, were cinematically beautiful. I really enjoyed the slowed down action sequences where you're really seeing what's happening in them. I really enjoy when stuff like that happens, so I will happily watch the next one. It's kind of fun to have another science fantasy trilogy that you can just watch, and it's pretty. Speaking of series, the audiobook I listened to this week was the second in its series, and that's Foxglove. The first one in this series was Belladonna, and Wisteria comes out later this year. I remember liking the first book of this well enough. It's about this girl who, when she was an infant, her parents and everyone at this ball they were hosting died, but she didn't die even though she should have died, and now she's had this connection with death ever since. And death is a literal immortal being that kind of visits her every once in a while, and she keeps trying to see if she can die, and she hasn't been able to figure that out, and she's basically just gotten to this point where all of her guardians keep dying because of different reasons, and she just has to wait a little bit longer before she gets her inheritance, and then she can just live in her family home and she doesn't have to talk to anybody anymore. She's not beholden to anyone anymore. However, she still has another 6 months, and she's going to a new place where a new mystery of who's trying to kill off this other person happens, and it goes from there. This is one of those books where I really would have liked a who's who and what happened in the first book at the beginning of the second book, because there were so many names and I was just going, who is this character? Why do I care about them? How are they related to the characters that we're talking about? And that happens so often that I just kind of like didn't care after a while. I was like, whatever, a character did a thing. There's a mystery now. We're trying to figure out who killed somebody else. Okay, sure, whatever. What I did like about this is not only did we get Cygna's perspective in this book, which is the same main character as the first book, but we also got Blythe's perspective, which is a character that we meet in the first book. And then we can kind of see how things seem very different about this whole situation from her perspective. By the end of this book, I was really getting into what was happening, and there were some clever things at the very end. However, at the beginning, I was just so confused about who was who and what happened, and like, I read this book last January. You would think that I would remember more details from it, and yet. So it was kind of one of those situations where like I was already listening to the audiobook, so I just continued and that was fine. However, if I had picked this up in print, I don't know if I would have continued reading. There's literally no way for me to know that. I have a suspicion, however, that I would have spent a lot of time going back and being like, who is this character again? Why do I care about this person? How do they relate? I cannot remember. Whereas with the audiobook, I was just like, whatever, a character did a thing. I'm sure that'll be important later, maybe. That's it for this week. If you've read, watched, or listened to any of these, let me know about it down in the comments below. On the way down to the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. If you don't feel like leaving a comment, but want to make sure that I know you were here, just leave me an emoji or a smiley face if you happen to be on your keyboard. Some people have asked if there's a way to financially support this channel, so I set up a Ko-fi account, which is a digital tipping service. The link for that, as always, is down below. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!